Today we're going to be comparing fractions by finding the least common denominator. Our objectives are students will compare two fractions with the same denominator using the symbols greater than, equal to, or less than, and students will justify their solutions. So first, a quick review. We talked about multiples, which is the product of a whole number multiplied by any other number. So the first 6 multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24. And then a common multiple is a number that is a multiple of 2 or more numbers. So some common multiples of 3 and 6 are 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, and 36. And then the least common multiple is the smallest common multiple of a set of 2 or more numbers. So if we're looking at the set of multiples for 5 and 6, we can see that 30 is going to be our least common multiple because it's the smallest number that both of those two numbers have in common. So in order to compare two fractions with unlike denominators, we need to rewrite the fractions as equivalent fractions with common denominators. To find common denominators, we find the least common multiple of the two denominators. The least common multiple is also known as finding the least common denominator. So to find the least common denominator of 1/3 and 3/5, our first step is to list the multiples of 3 and 5. So for 3 we have 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15, and then 5 we have 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. So our step 2 is to compare the list of multiples and find the least common multiple. So if we're looking at both of these lists, we see that 15 is the smallest number that both of them have in common, so that means our least common denominator and our least common multiple is going to be 15. So step 3 is write equivalent fractions using the least common denominator of 15. So we have to write a fraction with a denominator of 15 that is equivalent to 1/3. So for 1/3, to make an equivalent fraction, we have to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So we need to think what times 3 is going to give us 15, and in this case it's 5. So we're going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by 5 for an equivalent fraction of 5/15. We also have to write a fraction with a denominator of 15 that is equivalent to 3/5. So in this case we need to multiply both 3 and 5 by the same number, and in this case it's going to be 3 that will give us 15. So we're going to multiply both by 3, and we're going to get 9/15 as our equivalent fraction for 3/5. Step 4 is compare the numerators. So with our two new fractions, 5/15 and 9/15, we compare these two, and since 5 is smaller than 9, we see that 5/15 is less than 9/15. And since 5/15 and 1/3 are equivalent, and 9/15 and 3/5 are equivalent, that means that 1/3 is less than 3/5. Whenever we are comparing fractions, there is a shortcut. So in finding the least common denominator, first look to see if the smaller denominator divides evenly into the larger denominator. If it does, use the larger denominator as your least common denominator. So for example, if we were comparing 1/2 and 3/8, we know that 2 divides evenly into 8. Therefore, 8 is our least common denominator. This means we only have to write an equivalent fraction for 1/2 with a denominator of 8. So again, we have to multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number. So in this instance, we're looking for what number we would multiply by 2 to equal 8, which in this case is 4. So we're going to multiply both the 1 and the 2 by 4 to get 4/8. So now we're going to compare the numerators of 4/8 and 3/8. And since 4 is larger than 3, we see that 4/8 is greater than 3/8. And since 4/8 and 1/2 are equivalent, that means that 1/2 is greater than 3/8. So in a quick example, we're going to compare 1/4 and 2/5. So first we're going to check to see if we can use the shortcut. So since 4 does not divide evenly into 5, we can't use it. So that means we have to list out the multiples of both 4 and 5. So we get 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and 24 for 4, and 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 for 5. So our step 2 is to compare the list of multiples and find the least common multiple. So the smallest number that both of these have in common is 20. So that means that 20 is going to be our least common denominator. Step 3, we're going to write equivalent fractions using the least common denominator of 20. So for 1/4, we need to think what times 4 is going to give us 20, and we have to divide it by, or we have to multiply both the numerator and denominator by it, and in this case it's going to be 5. So we're going to multiply both the 1 and 4 by 5, and we're going to get 5/20. And then we have to write an equivalent, or write a fraction with a denominator of 20 that is equivalent to 2/5, our other fraction. So we need to multiply the numerator and denominator by a number that is going to give us 20. So in this case, it's going to be 5 times 4 is going to give us 20. So we're going to get 8/20 for our second equivalent fraction. Step 4 is comparing the numerators. So our two new fractions are 5/20 and 8/20, and 8 is larger than 5, so that means that 5/20 is going to be less than 8/20. And then, since 5/20 and 1/4 are equivalent, and 8/20 and 2/5 are equivalent, we can rewrite this equation as 1/5 is less than 1/4 is less than 2/5. Another example, we're going to compare 2/3 and 4/9. So first we check to see if we can use the shortcut. And in this case we can, because 3 does divide evenly into 9. So we know that in this case our least common denominator is going to be 9. So now we need to find an equivalent fraction for 2/3 with the denominator of 9. So again, we're going to multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number. And in this case, we're going to use 3 because 3 times 3 is going to give us 9. And then 2 times 3 is 6, so we get a new fraction of 6/9. And now we're going to compare the numerators of 6/9 and 4/9. And since 6 is larger than 4, we're going to get 6/9 is greater than 4/9. And now that we know since 6/9 is also equivalent to 2/3, we can switch it out for 2/3 is greater than 4/9. Okay, so now you guys are going to have a couple of problems to do on your own and then bring back to class tomorrow, and then we're going to go over them to make sure you guys are understanding this.